Hello, thank you for joining me today. We are going to talk about self-care, stress, and mental health and discuss how they can pertain to a CHW. So what is mental health? Mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual recognizes their own potential, how you can cope with the normal stresses of life, work productively and fruitfully, and are able to contribute to your community. Mental health is something that everyone has. How well we take care of it depends on the individual. It includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And it can affect how we think, feel, and act. And so a mental health crisis would be when an individual's state of mind causes them to be unable to cope with or adjust to everyday stressors. Any situation where a person's behavior puts them at risk of hurting themselves or others, or is severely disoriented or out of touch with reality or otherwise out of control. The focus of this lesson is not to provide education on mental health, but to provide you with a good enough understanding of your own mental health so that you're able to identify when you are not managing your own mental health. So what is stress? It is a feeling of emotional or physical tension. It can come from any event or thought that makes you feel frustrated, angry, or nervous. It is our body's reaction to a challenge or demand. And if not addressed or managed, stress can start to overwhelm us, especially for those of us who work in the helping profession, like CHWs. What does stress look like in adults? It can look like frequent, unexplained crying, mood swings, feeling overwhelmed, irritability, easily angered, loss of sleep, and stress can also manifest itself in physical symptoms like headaches and chest pains. You can also have changes in eating patterns. Added to what we can consider as everyday regular stress are the stressors associated with the ongoing pandemic. For many people, COVID has brought up many new worries. People are worrying about jobs, health, families, and the future. There may be anxiety about future health or the health of a loved one, fear about transmitting it to household members, and the unknown. And even now, though we are experiencing low numbers of positive cases and hospitalizations, there are still those unknowns, and the effects of the pandemic are still ongoing. So why are we talking about stress? It's to help us get started in identifying and recognizing our stress triggers. In recognizing how stress looks like in ourselves, we can begin to take steps to address it. So some stressors related to working in the helping profession may be grief and anxiety. It may be emotional exhaustion, which is a chronic state of physical and emotional depletion that results from excessive job, personal demands, and/or continuous stress. It describes a feeling of being emotionally overextended and exhausted by one's life. As you are working with people, you may gain insight on injustices and health disparities that they are experiencing in their communities. And lastly, you can even experience secondary trauma and/or vicarious trauma. So what is secondary traumatic stress? It is the indirect exposure to trauma through firsthand descriptions of a traumatic event or experience. It is a natural byproduct of working with traumatized clients, and it can be very disruptive, draining, and have long-lasting negative effects. Our goal is to help you to be aware of the signs and symptoms and help you create a system to mitigate and reduce the effects on you as a CHW. Secondary traumatic stress disorder is often called compassion fatigue. It can also be referred to as vicarious trauma, although the difference is that Secondary trauma can refer to one event, while vicarious trauma refers to the cumulative effects or develops over time. The common symptoms of compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress can be divided into fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. None of these symptoms can be divided into four categories of concern, but several of these, especially if you have a combination of the different categories, are reason to talk with your supervisor or seek professional help. None of these symptoms will be so the first category is cognitive. This can look like a decreased ability to focus or to experience common symptoms of apathy, which is a lack of interest, enthusiasm, or concern. You can experience rigid thinking, perfectionism, preoccupation with trauma. The next category is emotional. Some symptoms include guilt, anger, numbness, sadness, helplessness. Behavioral symptoms include withdrawing from friends and family, sleep disturbances. You're either sleeping a lot more or a lot less. Appetite changes, again, eating more or less. Being hypervigilant, having an elevated startle response. And lastly, the physical symptoms can look like an increase of heart rate, difficulty breathing, muscle and joint pain, an impaired immune system, and increased severity of medical concerns. Additionally, it can also involve a spiritual component, such as questioning the meaning of life or a loss of faith. And so after talking through stress and some symptoms we need to be aware of, we also have to recognize that there are barriers to accessing mental health services. These same barriers that are faced by our clients are barriers we may also face. So health coverage. Not all health coverage covers mental health services, and not everybody has access to that health coverage. If you are self-employed, you would have to seek this outside on your own. You may not always be eligible for the state programs. If somebody is undocumented, again, not eligible. And even if you're fully employed, not all employers offer this as a benefit. That cost. So even if you are insured, there's typically an out-of-pocket cost for mental health services. And depending on what's covered, it may be low or it can be pretty high. And this is the same as if you are uninsured and you're trying to access these services on your own. Stigma. So mental health services, mental health overall, having any mental health needs, there is stigma in our society. This can also depend on culture. And so you may not want your family, friends, or even coworkers to be aware that you're in need of mental health services. And so that does have an effect. And finally, access. So similar to the people that you work with, whether or not there's available services in your area is gonna affect you as well. Some people, especially those that are more rural, will have to travel longer distances in order to have access. One of the good things of the pandemic is that there's been a shift to more telehealth services. Mental health services are one of these. And so in some ways, if you do have access to this, that opens up the possibilities as well. Thank you for joining.